Well, I've always been interested in animals and birds, and particularly in drawing animals and birds. So in that business of curiosity, I guess, one thing just leads to another. I became very interested in science, very interested in not only what animals and birds looked like, but how they were made and how they behaved. And one thing led to another. So that's the reason for my interest, and it still continues today. I became quite curious about how ancient animals might have looked and how they may have behaved and lived in their world. So I became a little bit more like a detective in a sense, and started to look at the fossil record to see if I could understand what ancient animals looked like and see whether I was able to, in fact, build up the bones, build up the muscle tissues that were attached to those bones, to see if I could get an idea of what, for example, dinosaurs might have looked like. Quite often scientists will come to me with a particular problem that they need to illustrate. Now sometimes it's directly to do with their research, and sometimes it's directly to do with a wider project, which might be illustrations for a book or to actually summarise a particular area of interest that they have, which involves producing a much larger painting. But ostensibly they'll come to me with an idea or with a specimen that they want to understand and illustrate. So sometimes my initial role is to actually simply document something in the way that a camera would or that sort of thing. So I need to draw something and then present the initial findings to them. But it's more complicated than that, because the type of work that I do in reconstructing and understanding past life draws in areas of science from a number of different disciplines. So I need to talk to Pat and her colleagues, for example, about all sorts of things. What sort of environment the fossils were found in, what was the sediment like, and those sorts of things. So there's aspects of geology. And we're looking at our fossils deposited within this section. So that is the exposed surface in between these layers.
So Peter, in the field, in actual fact, that's the way the rock is.
That's the way it is, and that's what that represents.
What we're doing is we're looking up.
There's also aspects of microbiology, what sorts of plant pollens and spores were preserved in the environment to get an idea of the habitat. We then also need to talk to anatomists and specialists who have expertise in particular groups of animals to get a feeling and an understanding of that particular part of the project. What, for example, this particular group of dinosaurs might have been like, and how people view them, because all of these processes are involved in understanding the context in which these animals have been buried and the context in which they would have originally lived. So it becomes a multiple disciplinary thing. So we need to talk together to get an understanding of those fields and sort out where our problems are, where we don't have information, what information we do have, and put it together piece by piece. So my part of it is not in isolation. I need to talk to a huge number of people and do literature research, for example, and go to museums and look at specimens and sketch things, and gradually, piece by piece, put the jigsaw puzzle back together again. And quite often in that process we come across things that we don't understand, and that may then need us to go back and do some research work or some further investigation to solve some of those problems. The process really has a heavy emphasis on what we call comparative knowledge, comparative anatomy, and understanding of the biology of the modern world, because it's from the processes of the modern world that we can apply to trying to piece together this fragmentary record of the past. And comparative anatomy, understanding how a modern animal might be built, how it might move and behave, is also quite a key. So piecing together the final images does depend upon a lot of general knowledge, and I plug that information into the reconstructions all the time. And when I produce ideas and come up with those sorts of things, I throw them over to the scientists and they look at the work and say, yes, this looks right to me, this doesn't look right to me, because we think that these legs operated in this way, it had these sorts of feet with these sorts of claws, and we know from the trackway evidence we have that it walked with this sort of stride. Readjust your illustration. So this is the dynamic of the work that we're doing all the time. If I had a time machine, I guess it's a bit like the Jurassic Park story. If you were able to go back, say, to the Cretaceous, it would be probably a fairly frightening and awe-inspiring experience. It would be dramatic and it would be dangerous, but for a biologist it would be absolutely fascinating. But the Pre-Cambrian has got me fascinated. Going back from the time of the Mesozoic, say 100, 200 million years ago, back as far as, say, 600 million years ago, to find out how the complex life processes actually started to kick off. That to me would be a really fascinating time. It's not as dramatic because the animals aren't as big and as fierce looking, but it's an environment that would be very foreign to me, and I've become quite curious about how this whole business started. Well, when we go back to the Pre-Cambrian time, I've got a specimen here from that period that shows you the very subtle three-dimensional preservation of the surface of an organism. And you can see that it's quite distorted and it's quite flexible, and that it relates to that reconstruction of a fairly flat, flexible organism on the sea floor. The specimen that I'm holding here, again, is a Pre-Cambrian specimen, but it shows a little bit more of the original seabed that existed at the time. You can see here the very subtle longitudinal ripple marks of the sand on the sea floor, and impressed upon it is a whole series of specimens, small circular objects and larger circular objects, and all sorts of pieces of unidentifiable material that have been present on the seabed as this was preserved. When we originally saw this sort of material, they looked like medusae or little jellyfish, circular structures, and that's for a long time that's what they were believed to be. But with further investigation and understanding how these sediments were laid down on the seabed, we began to realise that these circular structures were only part of the organism. And this is what I mean when I say that when we're dealing with the fossil record, the evidence is often fragmentary. Here we have very detailed evidence, but it's evidence of only part of the organism. We realised that these were discs. This was the circular structures that attached a large fern-like or frond-like organism to the seabed, and this is all what we were seeing. Other specimens that we've found later have shown us that the detailed structure of the organism that was actually swaying in the sea currents of the time was a much larger, segmented sort of structure. And you can see here from the circular discs which were implanted into the seabed that from that grew a large frond-like organism that had a whole series of ribs along a large vein, and these would have filtered nutrients from the ocean environment of the time. One of my earliest works in dealing with the Cretaceous was to paint the environment of the animals that we were finding locally here in Australia. And ultimately I came up with an image with a dead dinosaur, and lots of people ask me, well, why did you paint a dead dinosaur? And there's a couple of very important reasons for that. One is I wanted to get across the idea that when we're looking at animals of the past, it's a forensic investigation. We're always looking at dead things, things that have survived in the sediments for thousands and millions of years, but they're bits and pieces of a crime scene, essentially. So rather than try and piece together too much from my imagination, putting A and B together, which we knew, and then trying to put C together from our estimations, I decided to stick with the facts of what we actually had. So I could show in this one illustration the types of evidence we have, little bits of teeth that have survived from fish, and we would find a lungfish tooth right next to a single dinosaur tooth. Now, those two small pieces of evidence represent whole living, breathing animals, the rest of the structure of which we had very little idea. Rather than try and present a complete animal the foot structure of this dinosaur had me really confused. I wasn't really confident that I knew how it walked. So rather than trying to guess how it walked or use comparative knowledge to make a better guess, I thought, let's illustrate this setting as it was at the time. And I could show all those aspects of the environment, the cooling conditions during winter, the things that were being washed down the stream along with the dinosaur skeleton, to show what that habitat was actually like, more or less as we found it. And that was what led me to that sort of illustration. It explains a lot about the process of investigation. When I'm producing this work, one of the most commonly asked questions is, how long does it take me? In other words, if I have to paint an animal or a group of dinosaurs in their environment, how long does it take me? And it's always a difficult question to ask for one basic reason. You can understand from the sorts of things that I'm saying about the processes of investigation that the investigation itself, the detective work itself, is the most time-consuming part. I can produce the actual physical painting relatively quickly. So, for example, it might take me 6 months to talk to the scientists, to read the literature, to visit the museums, and to pull all that work together to get an idea of what I should do in the final painting. It may only take me a month or two to actually do the painting. So it's always a bit of a double-barrel answer in that sense, is that I often find it's difficult to do. The drawings can take matters of 20, 30 minutes. But sometimes the thinking about what I've got to do before I actually do the drawing can take days or weeks. That's just the nature of the job.